The mansion sat at the end of a long private road, hidden behind tall iron gates and rows of perfectly trimmed hedges. It was the kind of house that appeared in magazines, the kind of place where important people gathered to drink expensive wine and talk about things that ordinary people would never understand. And somewhere in the basement of that grand house, in a room barely big enough for a single bed and a small wooden dresser, lived a woman named Elena. She had been working there for 3 years. 3 years of waking up before the sun. 3 years of scrubbing marble floors until her knees ached. 3 years of washing dishes, folding laundry, and making herself invisible whenever guests arrived. That was the most important rule in that house. Be invisible. Do your work quietly. Never speak unless spoken to. Never look anyone in the eye for too long. Just exist in the background like a shadow that cleans up after itself. Elena was good at being invisible. Too good, perhaps. She came from a small village in Moldova, a country most people in this city had never even heard of. Back home, her family had been poor but proud. Her father worked in the fields. Her mother gave singing lessons to children in the village. And Elena, from the time she was 5 years old, had a gift that made everyone in the village stop and listen. Her voice. It was the kind of voice that made old women cry and young men forget what they were doing. When Elena sang in the village church on Sundays, people came from neighboring towns just to hear her. Her mother would stand in the back, tears rolling down her cheeks, whispering prayers of thanks for the blessing God had given her daughter. By the time Elena was 17, she had earned a scholarship to study at a music conservatory in the city. Her mother sold her only piece of gold jewelry to buy Elena a proper dress for her audition. Her father worked double shifts for months to save money for her train ticket. The day Elena left for the conservatory, the whole village came to see her off. Her mother held her face in both hands and said something Elena would never forget. "Your voice is not just yours, my child. It belongs to everyone who needs to hear it. Promise me, you will never let it go silent." Elena promised. She meant it with every piece of her heart. But life has a way of breaking promises we never intended to break. 2 years into her studies, Elena received a phone call that changed everything. Her mother had collapsed while teaching a lesson. By the time they got her to the hospital, it was already too late. A blood clot in her brain, quick and merciless. Elena rushed home, but she arrived 6 hours after her mother took her last breath. She never got to say goodbye. She never got to sing for her one last time. She never got to tell her that she was sorry for not calling more often, for being too busy with her studies, for taking their time together for granted. The funeral was held on a gray Thursday morning. The whole village gathered in the same church where Elena used to sing. Everyone expected her to perform something in her mother's memory. It was tradition. It was what her mother would have wanted. Elena stood up. She walked to the front of the church. She opened her mouth to sing, but nothing came out. It was as if her voice had died along with her mother. As if the music inside her had packed its bags and left without saying goodbye. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, mouth open, tears streaming down her face, while the whole village watched in heartbroken silence. She never sang again after that day. Not once in 7 years. After her mother's death, everything fell apart. Her father grew sick with grief and passed away the following winter. Elena dropped out of the conservatory. She couldn't afford it anymore, and honestly, she couldn't bear to be around music. Every note reminded her of her mother. Every melody felt like a knife in her chest. She took odd jobs to survive. Cleaning houses, washing dishes in restaurants, working in factories. Eventually, through a friend of a friend, she heard about an opportunity abroad. A wealthy family needed a live-in housekeeper. They would sponsor her visa. They would provide room and board. It wasn't the life Elena had dreamed of. But dreams felt like luxuries she could no longer afford. So she packed one small suitcase, left everything she knew behind, and flew across the ocean to become a servant in a stranger's house. The owner of the mansion was a man named Mr. Harrington. He was in his 60s, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that looked right through people like they were made of glass. He had spent 30 years as a music producer, working with some of the biggest names in the industry. His walls were covered with gold records and photographs of him shaking hands with celebrities. He barely noticed Elena. To him, She was just another employee. Someone who made his coffee in the morning and ensured his shirts were pressed perfectly. He spoke to her maybe once a week, usually to complain about something she had done wrong. Elena didn't mind. She preferred being ignored. It was easier that way. But there was one room in that mansion that both terrified and fascinated her. The piano room. It was a beautiful space, with tall windows that let in the afternoon light. In the center sat a grand piano, black and shining, worth more money than Elena would make in 10 years. Mr. Harrington rarely used it anymore. It was mostly for show, something to impress his guests. Elena was supposed to clean that room twice a week, dust the piano, polish the wood, vacuum the carpet. Simple tasks that should have taken 15 minutes. But sometimes, when she was sure no one was home, she would linger there a little longer than necessary. She would stand next to the piano and let her fingers hover just above the keys. Not touching them, just feeling the possibility of what they could create. Her heart would beat faster, her breath would catch in her throat, and somewhere deep inside her chest, something would stir. Something that had been sleeping for 7 long years. One evening in late autumn, Elena was cleaning the piano room when she thought she was completely alone. Mr. Harrington had left for a dinner meeting. The other staff had gone home. The house was silent, except for the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the hallway. Elena finished dusting the piano. She put down her cloth. She looked at the keys. Before she knew what she was doing, she sat down on the bench. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears. She hadn't touched a piano in 7 years. She hadn't even allowed herself to think about music, but something about that moment felt different. Maybe it was the silence of the house. Maybe it was the way the evening light fell across the keys. Maybe it was simply that she was tired of running from the one thing that had once made her feel alive. She pressed a single key. The note rang out, pure and clear, filling the empty room. And then, without planning to, without even deciding to, Elena began to sing. It started as a whisper, a melody her mother used to hum while cooking dinner. But as the music moved through her, the whisper grew stronger. The notes rose higher. And for the first time in 7 years, Elena's voice returned. She sang with her eyes closed, tears streaming down her face, pouring out every ounce of grief and longing she had buried deep inside herself. She sang for her mother. She sang for the life she had lost. She sang for the girl she used to be. She had no idea that someone was listening. Mr. Harrington had come home early that night. His dinner meeting had been cancelled at the last minute, and he was in a foul mood. He walked through the front door, tossed his coat on the nearest chair, and headed toward his study to pour himself a drink. But halfway down the hallway, he stopped. There was music coming from somewhere inside the house. Piano notes. Soft and melancholy, drifting through the air like smoke. And then, layered over the piano, a voice so hauntingly beautiful that it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. In 30 years of working in the music industry, Mr. Harrington had heard thousands of singers. He had worked with legends. He had discovered talents that went on to sell millions of records. He knew, within the first 3 seconds of hearing someone sing, whether they had something special or not. This voice had something he hadn't heard in a very long time. He followed the sound down the hallway, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. The music grew louder as he approached the piano room. The door was slightly open, and through the gap, he could see the glow of the evening light spilling across the floor. He pushed the door open, just a few inches, and looked inside. What he saw made him freeze in place. It was her, the housekeeper. The quiet woman who cleaned his toilets and folded his laundry. She was sitting at his grand piano, eyes closed, face wet with tears, singing an aria that he recognized from his days producing classical albums. Her voice filled the room like it was too big for such a small body. It climbed and soared, and broke his heart in ways he didn't think were possible anymore. For a full 2 minutes, he stood there watching her, completely unable to move. When the song ended, Elena opened her eyes. And that's when she saw him standing in the doorway. The color drained from her face. She jumped up from the piano bench so fast she nearly knocked it over. Her hands flew to her mouth. Her whole body started trembling. "Mr. Harrington, I am so sorry," she stammered, her accent thicker than usual in her panic. "I should not have touched the piano. I know it is not allowed. Please, I will never do it again. Please do not fire me." She was already backing toward the door, ready to run, ready to disappear back into the shadows where she belonged. But Mr. Harrington didn't look angry. He looked stunned. He looked like a man who had just witnessed something he couldn't explain. "Stop," he said quietly. Elena froze. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat felt like it was closing up. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice sharper now. "Where did you learn to sing like that? Who trained you?" Elena swallowed hard. "My mother," she whispered. "She was a voice teacher. In Moldova. I studied at a conservatory for 2 years before she passed away." Mr. Harrington stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something that confused her completely. He laughed. Not a kind laugh. Not a warm laugh. A short, bitter sound that held no joy at all. 3 years, he said, shaking his head. "You have been cleaning my house for 3 years. And you never thought to mention that you can sing like that?" Elena didn't know what to say. She had never thought of her voice as something worth mentioning. It belonged to another life. A life that had ended the day her mother died. "It does not matter now," she said quietly. "That was a long time ago. I do not sing anymore." "You were just singing. That was a mistake. It will not happen again." She tried to leave, but Mr. Harrington held up his hand. "Wait," he said. "I need to talk to you about something." He walked into the room and sat down in one of the leather chairs near the window. He gestured for her to sit in the chair across from him. Elena hesitated, then slowly lowered herself onto the edge of the seat, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mr. Harrington rubbed his temples like he was fighting off a headache. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired. "I have a problem," he said. "A big one. Next Saturday, I am hosting my annual charity gala. 200 guests. Some of the most important people in this city, politicians, business leaders, celebrities. The event raises money for children's hospitals. It's the most important night of my year." Me. Elena nodded, though she didn't understand what any of this had to do with her. "I had booked a singer for the event," he continued. "A famous soprano from Europe. She was supposed to be the highlight of the evening. But this morning, I received a call. She broke her ankle skiing in Switzerland. She cannot travel. She cannot perform." He leaned forward, his cold blue eyes locked onto Elena's face. "The gala is in 6 days. Every other singer I know is either booked or not good enough. I have been making phone calls all day, and I have nothing. Do you understand what I am saying?" Elena's heart started beating faster. She was beginning to understand, and the realization filled her with dread. "No," she said, already shaking her head. "No, Mr. Harrington. I cannot. You haven't even heard what I'm asking. I know what you are asking, and I cannot do it. I told you, I do not sing anymore. What you heard tonight was a mistake. It has been 7 years since I performed for anyone. I cannot stand on a stage in front of 200 strangers. I cannot." Mr. Harrington's expression didn't change. He watched her with the calm patience of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. "Let me explain something to you, Elena," he said slowly. "Your work visa is sponsored by me. Your housing is provided by me. Everything you have in this country depends on me. If I decide tomorrow that I no longer need a housekeeper, you will be on a plane back to Moldova within the month." Elena felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "Are you threatening me?" she whispered. "I am offering you an opportunity," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "Sing at my gala. Give one performance. 15 minutes of your time. In exchange, I will double your salary. I will help you get permanent residency. I will make sure you never have to worry about being sent back. And if I refuse?" He shrugged, as if the answer was obvious. "Then I will find someone who appreciates the opportunities I provide." Elena sat there, frozen, her mind spinning. She thought about her tiny room in the basement. She thought about the years she had spent rebuilding her life from nothing. She thought about what it would mean to go back to Moldova with nothing to show for all her suffering. But then she thought about her mother. About the promise she had made. About the day her voice abandoned her at her mother's funeral, leaving her standing in front of everyone she knew, broken and silent. She hadn't sung in public since that day. The thought of doing it again made her feel like she was going to be sick. "I need time to think," she said, her voice barely audible. "You have until tomorrow morning," Mr. Harrington replied. He stood up and walked toward the door. Before he left, he paused and looked back at her. "You have a gift, Elena. A rare one. It would be a shame to waste it cleaning floors for the rest of your life." Then he was gone. Elena sat alone in the piano room for a long time. The sun had fully set now, and the only light came from the moon shining through the tall windows. She looked at the piano, its black surface gleaming in the darkness. She thought about her mother, about the last words she had spoken to her before she left for the conservatory. "Your voice is not just yours. It belongs to everyone who needs to hear it. Promise me you will never let it go silent." Elena had broken that promise 7 years ago, and now life was forcing her to decide whether she was ready to keep it again. By morning, she had made her choice. She found Mr. Harrington in his study and stood in the doorway, her hands trembling at her sides. "I will do it," she said quietly. "I will sing at your gala." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I knew you would make the right decision," he said. "Do not disappoint me." Elena nodded and turned to leave. As she walked back to her room in the basement, she felt like she was walking toward something she couldn't see. Something that would either save her or destroy her. She had 6 days to find out which one it would be. The 6 days leading up to the gala were the longest of Elena's life. Every morning, she still woke up before dawn to do her regular duties. She still scrubbed floors, washed dishes, and folded laundry. But now, in the afternoons, Mr. Harrington had arranged for her to practice in the piano room with a vocal coach he had hired. The coach was a thin woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue. She had trained opera singers for decades, and she made it very clear from the first session that she thought the whole situation was ridiculous. "You want me to prepare a housekeeper to perform at a gala in less than a week?" she had said to Mr. Harrington on the first day. "This is impossible. It takes years to develop proper technique. You cannot rush art." But then Elena started to sing. The coach stopped talking. Her expression changed from annoyance to confusion, to something that looked almost like wonder. When Elena finished, the woman was silent for a long moment. "Where have you been hiding?" she finally asked. Elena didn't know how to answer that question. She had been hiding in plain sight. In the basement of a mansion. In the shadows of her own grief. In the silence she had wrapped around herself like a protective blanket. The rehearsals were brutal. The coach pushed Elena harder than anyone had pushed her since her days at the conservatory. They worked on breathing exercises, vocal warm-ups, and the specific aria that Mr. Harrington had chosen for her to perform. It was called O mio babbino caro, a famous piece from an Italian opera, a song about a daughter pleading with her father. Elena knew the song well. Her mother used to sing it around the house when Elena was a child. Hearing it again, after all these years, felt like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. Some days, Elena would break down in the middle of practice. The emotions would become too much, and she would have to stop and collect herself. The coach would watch her with a mixture of impatience and something that might have been sympathy. "You carry a lot of pain," the coach said to her one afternoon. "I can hear it in your voice." Most singers spend their whole careers trying to find that kind of emotional depth. You have it naturally, but you must learn to control it, or it will control you. Elena tried. She tried so hard. But every time she sang that song, she saw her mother's face. She heard her mother's voice. She felt the weight of all the years she had spent running away from the one thing that connected them. At night, Elena couldn't sleep. She would lie in her narrow bed in the basement, staring at the ceiling, her heart racing with fear. What if she got on that stage, and her voice disappeared again, like it had at her mother's funeral? What if she stood in front of 200 strangers and no sound came out? What if she humiliated herself, and Mr. Harrington fired her anyway? The thoughts circled in her head like vultures, picking at her confidence until there was almost nothing left. On the 5th day, something unexpected happened. Elena was in the piano room, practicing alone, when one of the other housekeepers knocked on the door. Her name was Rosa, an older woman from the Philippines, who had worked in the mansion even longer than Elena. They had never been close, but Rosa had always been kind to her in small ways. A smile in the hallway, an extra portion of food saved from dinner. Rosa stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "I heard you practicing," she said softly. "I have been listening all week from the kitchen." Elena felt embarrassed. "I am sorry if I disturbed you." "Disturbed me?" Rosa shook her head, and Elena noticed that her eyes were wet. "Child, your voice is the most beautiful thing I have heard in 20 years. When you sing, it sounds like angels are crying." Elena didn't know what to say. She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. Rosa walked closer and placed a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder. "I know you are scared," she said. "I can see it in your face. But I want you to know something. Whatever happens at that gala, you have already done something amazing. You have found your voice again. That is a gift. Do not let fear take it away from you." She squeezed Elena's shoulder once, then turned, and left the room without another word. That night, for the first time all week, Elena slept peacefully. The day of the gala arrived like a storm rolling over the horizon. Elena woke up with her stomach in knots. She could barely eat breakfast. Her hands were shaking so badly, she could hardly button her uniform. The mansion transformed throughout the day. Caterers arrived with trays of food. Florists filled every room with arrangements of white roses and lilies. A crew set up a small stage at one end of the grand ballroom, complete with a microphone and a spotlight. Elena tried to stay busy with her regular chores, but she couldn't focus on anything. Every time she passed the ballroom, she would look at that stage and feel her heart climb into her throat. In the late afternoon, Mr. Harrington called her into his study. "I have arranged for a dress for you," he said, handing her a garment bag. "Get yourself ready. The guests start arriving at 7. You will perform at 9 o'clock sharp." Elena took the bag and went to her room. Inside was a long black gown. Simple but elegant. It was the nicest piece of clothing she had ever worn, but when she looked at herself in the small mirror on her wall, she didn't see a performer. She saw a scared woman pretending to be something she wasn't. The hours crawled by. Elena could hear the guests arriving upstairs. The sound of laughter and conversation filtered down to the basement like noise from another world. She paced back and forth in her tiny room, trying to calm her breathing, trying to remember everything the coach had taught her. At 8:45, there was a knock on her door. It was time. A staff member led her through the back corridors of the mansion, away from the guests, to a small area behind the stage. Elena stood there alone, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her temples. Through a gap in the curtain, she could see the ballroom. It was packed, 200 people, maybe more, all dressed in expensive suits and glittering gowns. Chandeliers sparkled overhead. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne. Elena recognized a few faces from magazines and television: politicians, business leaders, a famous actress she had seen in movies. These were the most powerful people in the city. And in a few minutes, she was supposed to stand in front of them and sing. She felt like she was going to faint. Then she heard Mr. Harrington's voice through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming tonight. As you know, our scheduled performer was unfortunately unable to join us. But I have a special surprise for you, a hidden talent that I recently discovered right here in my own home." A few people in the crowd chuckled. Elena heard someone whisper, "What is he talking about? Please welcome to the stage a very special performer." That was her cue. Elena's legs felt like they were made of concrete. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. to hide, to go back to her basement room and never come out again. But then she thought of her mother. She thought of Rosa's kind words. She thought of the promise she had made so many years ago. She stepped out from behind the curtain and walked onto the stage. The spotlight hit her like a wave of heat. She was blinded for a moment, unable to see anything but white light. As her eyes adjusted, the faces of the audience came into focus. Some looked curious, some looked confused. A few were barely paying attention, still chatting among themselves. She was nobody to them, just a servant in a borrowed dress. Elena walked to the center of the stage. Her legs were trembling. Her hands were cold and damp. She gripped the microphone stand to keep herself steady. The pianist, a young man hired for the evening, began to play the opening notes of the aria. Elena opened her mouth, and nothing came out. Panic seized her chest. It was happening again, just like at her mother's funeral. Her voice had abandoned her at the worst possible moment. The pianist kept playing, waiting for her to begin. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. Elena saw Mr. Harrington standing near the back of the room, his face tight with anger. She closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw her mother. Not sick, not dying, but young and beautiful, standing in their small kitchen in Moldova, humming while she cooked dinner. She saw her mother's smile. She felt her mother's hand brushing the hair from her face. "Your voice is not just yours," her mother whispered in her memory. "It belongs to everyone who needs to hear it." Elena took a deep breath, and then she began to sing. The first note that came out of Elena's mouth was soft, almost fragile, like a candle flame flickering in the wind, threatening to go out at any moment. But it didn't go out. Instead, it grew stronger. The second note was fuller, richer. By the third note, something had shifted in the room. The people who had been chatting among themselves slowly stopped talking. The waiters froze in place, trays still balanced on their palms. Even the clinking of glasses went silent. Elena kept her eyes closed. She couldn't bear to look at the audience. Instead, she focused on the music, letting it carry her the way a river carries a leaf. She thought of her mother. She thought of their small kitchen in Moldova. She thought of all the years she had spent in silence, hiding from the one thing that made her feel alive, and she poured all of it into her voice. The aria was about a daughter begging her father to understand her heart. It was about love and desperation, and the fear of losing everything. Elena didn't have to pretend to feel those emotions. She had lived them. She was living them right now. Standing on this stage in a borrowed dress, fighting for her future with nothing but the voice her mother had given her. As the song built toward its emotional peak, Elena's voice soared higher and higher. It filled every corner of the grand ballroom. It bounced off the chandeliers and wrapped around the marble columns. It reached into the chest of every person in that room and grabbed hold of something they had forgotten they had. In the front row, an older woman in a diamond necklace brought her hand to her mouth. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She didn't seem to care. A few tables away, a powerful businessman who was known for his cold demeanor sat completely still. His champagne glass was frozen halfway to his lips. His eyes were fixed on Elena like he was seeing something impossible. Near the bar, two young men in designer suits had been laughing about something just moments before. Now they stood in silence. Their expressions completely changed. One of them wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked away, embarrassed to be crying in public. Even the staff members who had been working in the background stopped what they were doing. A waiter stood motionless near the kitchen door, a tray of empty glasses forgotten in his hands. A young woman from the catering team leaned against the wall, tears rolling down her cheeks. Elena's voice did something that no amount of money or power or fame could do. It reached past all the walls people build around themselves. It touched the places they keep hidden. It reminded them of their mothers, their first loves, their deepest losses, their most secret hopes. For 4 minutes and 32 seconds, 200 of the most important people in the city forgot about their business deals and political games and social status. They forgot about everything except the sound of a servant's voice filling the room like light filling a dark space. When Elena reached the final note, she held it longer than she had ever held it in practice. It hung in the air, pure and clear, vibrating with an emotion that words could never capture. Then, slowly, she let it fade into silence. She opened her eyes. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was completely still. Elena's heart dropped. She thought she had failed. She thought they had hated it. She thought she would be laughed at and sent back to her basement room in shame. Then the woman in the front row stood up. She started clapping. Slowly at first, then faster. Then the man next to her stood up. Then another person. And another. And another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet. The applause was thunderous. It echoed off the walls and ceiling like a storm. People were cheering. People were wiping their eyes. People were looking at Elena like they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Elena stood frozen on the stage, unable to process what was happening. She had expected polite clapping at best. She had prepared herself for awkward silence, or even mockery. She had not prepared herself for this. A man pushed his way through the crowd toward the stage. He was in his 70s, with white hair and a face that Elena vaguely recognized from somewhere. He stopped at the edge of the stage and looked up at her with an expression of complete astonishment. "Young lady," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I have been directing operas for 50 years. I have worked with the greatest singers in the world. And I have never, in all my life, I've heard anything like what you just did." Elena didn't know what to say. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The man turned to look at Mr. Harrington, who was standing near the back of the room with a stunned expression on his face. "Who is this woman?" the director demanded. "Where has she been? Why have I never heard of her?" Mr. Harrington walked slowly toward the stage. For once, he seemed to be at a loss for words. The cold, calculating businessman who always had a plan for everything looked like a man who had just watched a miracle happen in his own home. "She works for me," he said quietly. A murmur went through the crowd. People exchanged glances of disbelief. The famous opera director looked from Mr. Harrington to Elena and back again, as if he was waiting for someone to tell him this was all a joke. "Your housekeeper," he repeated flatly. "She has been cleaning my house for 3 years, Mr. Harrington said. "I only discovered she could sing a week ago." The director shook his head slowly. 3 years, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. 3 years. This voice has been scrubbing your floors. Do you have any idea what you've been wasting? More people started approaching the stage. A woman introduced herself as a talent agent and pressed a business card into Elena's trembling hand. A man said he was a producer and asked if she had representation. Someone else mentioned a recording contract. Someone else mentioned a concert hall. Elena felt like she was drowning. There were too many faces, too many voices, too much happening all at once. She clutched the microphone stand to keep herself steady and tried to remember how to breathe. Through the crowd, she spotted Rosa standing near the kitchen door. The older woman was crying openly, not even trying to hide it. When their eyes met, Rosa smiled and nodded slowly, as if to say, "I told you so." That small moment of connection helped Elena find her footing again. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. People kept coming up to her, shaking her hand, telling her she was extraordinary. Important people who wouldn't have looked at her twice that morning were now treating her like she was someone worth knowing. When the gala finally ended and the last guests left, Elena found herself alone in the empty ballroom. The chandeliers were still lit, casting a warm glow over the tables that hadn't been cleared yet. Champagne glasses stood half empty. Napkins lay crumpled on chairs. Elena walked slowly to the stage where she had stood just a few hours ago. She touched the microphone stand, still not quite believing what had happened. She had done it. She had faced her greatest fear and survived. More than survived. She had found something she thought was lost forever. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned to see Mr. Harrington standing in the doorway. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The man who had forced her onto that stage looked different somehow. Smaller, less sure of himself. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "The way I pushed you into this, the things I threatened, That was wrong of me. Elena considered his words. A week ago, she had been terrified of this man. He had held her entire future in his hands and used it against her. But standing here now, she realized something important. He had also given her something she could never have given herself. He had forced her to face the things she had been running from for 7 years. He had made her sing again. You did what you thought you had to do, she said quietly. And maybe I needed someone to push me. I was never going to do it on my own. Mr. Harrington nodded slowly. What happens now? He asked. Elena looked around the empty ballroom one last time. She thought about all the business cards in her pocket. All the offers. All the possibilities that hadn't existed when she woke up that morning. I don't know, she said honestly. But for the first time in 7 years, I'm not afraid to find out. She walked past him toward the door that led to the basement stairs. But before she reached it, she stopped and looked back. Thank you, she said. Then she disappeared down the stairs to her small room, where she lay awake all night, replaying every moment of the evening in her mind, wondering what tomorrow would bring. She didn't have to wonder for long. By morning, everything had changed. Elena woke up the next morning to the sound of her phone buzzing. It was an old phone. A cheap model she had bought years ago. It rarely made any noise because hardly anyone ever called her. But that morning, it wouldn't stop. She picked it up and saw dozens of notifications. Missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Text messages from people she had never met. And emails. So many emails that her inbox had crashed trying to load them all. She didn't understand what was happening until Rosa came rushing down the basement stairs, breathless and wide-eyed. Elena, she said, grabbing her by the shoulders. Have you seen the internet? Have you seen what's happening? Elena shook her head, confused. Rosa pulled out her own phone and showed her the screen. There was a video playing. It took Elena a moment to realize what she was looking at. It was her, on stage at the gala, singing. Someone in the audience had recorded her entire performance on their phone. They had posted it online late last night. And in just a few hours, it had spread like wildfire. The video already had over 2 million views. The comments section was flooded with messages from people all over the world. Who is this woman? Her voice made me cry. I've listened to this 15 times and I still get chills. This is what real talent looks like. No auto-tune. No tricks. Just pure emotion. Someone please find her and give her a record deal. Elena stared at the screen, unable to speak. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. She was a housekeeper. A nobody, a woman who had spent the last 7 years trying to disappear, but the world had found her anyway. Over the next 48 hours, Elena's life turned upside down. News outlets started calling the mansion, asking for interviews. Entertainment websites ran stories about the singing housekeeper, whose performance had gone viral. The video hit 10 million views, then 20 million. Then kept climbing higher. Mr. Harrington's phone rang constantly. Agents, managers, producers, record labels. Everyone wanted to talk to Elena. Everyone wanted a piece of what she had. Elena felt overwhelmed. She had gone from being invisible to being seen by millions of people overnight. She didn't know how to handle any of it. She didn't even know where to begin. One afternoon, about a week after the gala, she received a phone call that stood out from all the others. It was from the opera director who had approached her at the gala. The man who had worked with the greatest singers in the world for 50 years. I've been thinking about you constantly, he said. What you did at that gala was extraordinary. But it was also raw and untrained. You have a gift that most singers would trade their souls for. But you need guidance. You need someone to help you develop it properly. Elena listened quietly, her heart pounding. I want to offer you a scholarship, he continued. Full tuition at the conservatory where I teach. 3 years of training with the best vocal coaches in the country. Room and board included. Everything you need to become the singer you were meant to be. Elena's eyes filled with tears. It was the same dream she had given up 7 years ago, when her mother died. The dream that had felt forever out of reach, and now it was being handed back to her like a second chance at life. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The director was quiet for a moment. "Because I was in that room when you sang," he said. "And I saw what you did to those people. You made them feel something real. That's rare in this world. And it would be a crime to let a talent like yours go to waste." Elena accepted the scholarship. It wasn't even a difficult decision. For the first time in years, the path forward seemed clear. But before she could start her new life, there was something she needed to do. Something she had been avoiding for far too long. She needed to go home. Elena booked a flight to Moldova using the money she had saved over 3 years of working in the mansion. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get her there and back. The journey took almost 20 hours. A plane to Frankfurt, another plane to a small airport in Eastern Europe, then a long bus ride through the countryside, past fields and villages and roads she remembered from her childhood. When she finally arrived at her village, everything looked smaller than she remembered. The houses seemed lower to the ground. The streets seemed narrower. The church where she used to sing stood at the top of the hill, its white walls glowing in the afternoon sun. But Elena didn't go to the church. Not yet. Instead, she walked to the edge of the village, to a small cemetery surrounded by an iron fence. She pushed open the gate and walked down the rows of headstones until she found the one she was looking for, her mother's grave. The stone was simple. Just her mother's name and the dates of her birth and death. Someone had planted flowers around it, probably a neighbor who remembered her. Elena knelt in the grass and placed her hand on the cold stone. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. All the emotions she had been holding back came rushing up at once. The grief, the guilt, the years of silence, the fear that she had disappointed the woman who had believed in her more than anyone else in the world. "I'm sorry, Mama," she finally whispered. "I'm sorry I stopped singing. I'm sorry I broke my promise. I thought my voice died with you. I thought I would never be able to use it again." Tears streamed down her face, dripping onto the grass below. "But something happened. Something I never expected. Someone forced me to sing again. And when I did, it was like you were there with me. I could feel you. I could hear you telling me to keep going." She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I found my voice again, Mama. And this time, I'm not letting it go. I'm going back to school. I'm going to finish what we started. And every time I sing, I'll be singing for you." She stayed at the grave for a long time, talking to her mother about everything that had happened. About the mansion, and Mr. Harrington. About Rosa's kindness. About the gala, and the video, and all the crazy things that had followed. She talked until the sun began to set, and the sky turned orange and purple above the hills. Before she left, she sang one last song, the same aria she had performed at the gala, but this time, she sang it just for her mother, in the quiet cemetery, with no audience except the birds and the wind and the memory of the woman who had given her everything. When she finished, she kissed her fingers and pressed them against the headstone. "Thank you, Mama," she whispered, "for believing in me even when I couldn't believe in myself." Then she stood up, wiped the grass from her knees, and walked back to the village to catch the bus that would take her toward her new life. 3 months later, Elena stood on the stage of one of the most famous concert halls in the world. The seats were filled with thousands of people who had come to hear the woman whose video had touched their hearts. The lights were bright, the orchestra was ready. The moment she had dreamed about as a little girl in Moldova had finally arrived. But before the music began, Elena did something unusual. She stepped up to the microphone and spoke to the audience. "7 years ago, I lost my mother," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "And when I lost her, I lost my voice. I spent 7 years in silence, afraid that I would never sing again. But tonight, I want to dedicate this performance to her. Because everything I am, everything I have become, started with her. She taught me that music is not just sound. It is the language of the soul, and my soul belongs to her." She stepped back, nodded to the conductor, and as the orchestra began to play, Elena opened her mouth and sang. Her voice filled the hall like light filling a dark room. It reached every corner, every seat, every heart in the audience, and somewhere, in a place beyond time and space, Elena knew her mother was listening. She had kept her promise after all, and her silence was finally over.